Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank, it is a pleasure to extend to you the most cordial welcome to the presentation of our macroeconomic report, Latin America and the Caribbean for 2022. And this edition is entitled From Recovery to Renaissance, Turning the Crisis into Opportunity, because we believe in the search for opportunities at the IDB, even in the most complex situations, to continue developing, growing, strengthening countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. At the beginning of 2022, we saw how the world was recovering from the impact of COVID-19. And in the member countries, the borrowing countries of the IDB, we concentrated on deepening and consolidating that for a new, more sustainable growth and more inclusive growth. Then we had the war, unprovoked war from Russia to Ukraine, which has brought about global economic consequences and which also impact the region. The report that we're presenting today is a result of a quick turnaround of our research department, congratulations, in order to analyze the current repercussions and potential impact of the macroeconomic consequences in Latin America and the Caribbean in the coming months and years, and also taking into account other financial uncertainties. The factors that are competing in order to reduce the growth in this region underscore the urgency of promoting and enacting policies in order to improve the fiscal architecture as well as the labor architecture. This report offers concrete recommendations, and it also takes into account the role to be played by a strengthened region to respond to global pressures. Before the war, we saw with a concern the need for controlling the growing inflation in Latin America and the Caribbean and consolidating expansive fiscal positions that had been generated in order to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. At the same time, in the midst of the recovery, we come to realize that we had to contribute to solving structural problems in the labor markets that had been seen seriously impacted during the last 2 years, and particularly in the case of women. With the Russian war, we bring in new challenges added to those that have been previously identified, but we also see a window of opportunity. And we turn to that opportunities for some countries in the region in order to diversify, to strengthen on several fronts, in spite, obviously, of the global circumstances brought by these sad and devastating effects. The presentation to be made by our specialist here will explain this dynamic in more detail. So definitely the rise in hydrocarbon prices and other commodities could make it difficult for the situation of the inflation at a global level and in the region. Unfortunately, direct trade links of the region with Russia are relatively small, with some exceptions. For example, meat exports from Uruguay, fruits from Ecuador. Likewise, with the exception of fertilizers, the region imports very little from Russia. However, the war will also reduce the growth of our main trading partners. And that undoubtedly will be an obstacle for countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the scenario could turn even more difficult with the hardening of the monetary policy in the US. And in this scenario, we hope to expect a lower growth for the coming years, 22, 23, 24, but let us work just as we've done, and let us break away with these forecasts. Let us break away with these forecasts. But let's turn to the positive. It is probable that the increase in the price of commodities will contribute to growth and the growth of public finance in countries in the region. Several countries in the world import the same products from Russia and Ukraine that Latin America and the Caribbean. Let us take advantage of that. It would be better for the world. More exports from the region and more dependence on Latin America and the Caribbean. Besides oil and gas, our region exports iron, minerals, steel, wood, and many other products to the same markets in the US, Canada, and European countries and others. And in the markets at those where countries of the region participate jointly, in Russia and Ukraine, the value of exports from these countries go beyond $250 billion. Transforming. And since Latin American and Caribbean exporters already have a way into these markets, they could cover a significant share of what is missing. They could help us mitigate the pressures at a global level. So Latin America, the Caribbean could be a solution to the global inflation level, and we should aspire to that. That represents an opportunity for countries to look into other markets where the region might be competitive. The pandemic accelerated this trend, and the war will simply step it up. If the region can move forward on this scene, the reduced growth scenarios that we described today could be mitigated. And our macroeconomic report offers these opportunities in the trade sector, as well as limitations on fiscal reforms and labor reforms, which are essential in the region, that are urgently needed in order to deal with public and efficient expenditure, low productivity, and the informality that we can help control with this. This region has proven its resilience, as shown in growth rates for 2021 that challenged the forecast. Let's break away with these forecasts. Countries in Latin America and the Caribbean should have more effective and efficient policies for growth that will promote the competitiveness and will reduce inequality. I hope that the discussion of all these ideas will be extremely useful for the region.
Now, before I move on, switch to English, because I would like to take this opportunity to address some of the issues that obviously have been on people's minds. And I want to do it with the same frankness and forthrightness that I've always, since day one, spoken to you with. I ran convinced for president of the IDB that change and reform was possible. I ran to lead this institution from the 20th century fully into the 21st century. And we've come a long way in just 1.5 years. We have shown that it is possible. We had a record 2021, $23.5 billion in financing. We did it by optimizing our balance sheet. We did it through record public-private sector mobilization and financing. We did it without a capital injection. We almost doubled our previous 20-year median. I ran saying that the new normal should be $20 billion in financing. We surpassed that without a capital injection. And in the pathway that we now have after the annual meeting, we can turn that new normal, forget 20 billion. My new goal is 25 to 30 billion should be our new normal. And we did that while implementing historic savings. 2021 was a year of historic savings in this bank. We saved $10 million. That's $10 million that we then took for technical cooperation for the countries. And we did it by making cuts. We did it by breaking silos. We did it even through, they seem small actions, but like streamlining and ending chauffeurs and cars for senior executives. We're the only international financial institution to do that, by the way, and I'm proud of it. This is no longer an institution that uses private jets and chauffeured cars, and I'm proud of that. We launched an operational excellence initiative. We went from 270 days that it would take for an operation to, in 1 year, less than 170 days and counting. We went after our comparative disadvantage. We launched new sophisticated financial instruments to support countries. We launched modern metrics to measure impact and effectiveness. We launched the digital transformation initiative. We're leading by example with our institution digitalizing so that countries can digitalize, so they can help them democratize their systems and help democratize citizens' access to government. We strengthened confidence from the private sector. We created the largest private sector coalition in the bank. In 1 year, we created 40 initial senior executives of the biggest companies in the world to 160 that are working with us day and night on our Vision 2025 priorities. We introduced the bank to long neglected US and European investors, and the results speak for themselves with our historic mobilization. We presented at the annual meeting, we created IDB Invest 2.0, a state-of-the-art, first of its kind mobilization bank. Leaders of all international financial institutions. We presented a long overdue gender initiative. And for those of you that participated in the task force, it wasn't without opposition, but we forced it through. We named the highest ranking Latin American woman in the history of the bank, the first female chief of staff in the history of the bank. Our representatives in the region, which are like our ambassadors in each of the borrowing nations. When I stepped into the bank, only 10% of them were women. Today, over 45% of them are women. We changed the face of the bank in the region. We created a line of business specifically focused on empowering women entrepreneurs. I'm very proud of that. Rule of law, transparency. For the first time, we have now made rule of law and transparency part of our country strategies, something that both civil society and the private sector has been clamoring for. We're leading. But as I mentioned on gender, not all of these reforms and changes have been popular. We are well on our way into the 21st century. But now, an anonymous political media campaign led by a letter which coincidentally began the day after our successful annual meeting, where our governors approved historic reforms and a pathway for a capital increase for IDB Invest. Because God forbid the region advance, God forbid that we succeed. A campaign that aims to thrust our process not back to the 20th century, but to the 13th century, prior to the constitutionalization of some type of due process or Magna Carta times. How can we advocate rule of law and transparency? All over the last 2 weeks, staff of this bank, your colleagues, have been denied due process by a select few, who in turn have provenly and unaccountably, not allegedly, violated the code of ethics by weaponizing an anonymous letter to orchestrate a media campaign. That's a violation. The IDB has mechanisms in place for seriously handling matters of ethics, which I fully support and welcome. But none of those processes include proactively pitching stories to journalists to influence public opinion or to prejudge facts. Trust me. I would love to present to all of you today the direct evidence which I have, not circumstantial, not hearsay, not anonymous, the direct evidence of the truth. But I'm going to respect what should be a confidential process according to the rules of the bank. And the potential for an alleged investigation, which according to sources talking to the press, yet again, in violation of bank rules, has apparently been confirmed. But again, that I have not been informed. I think that. Nonetheless, I do hope that I am given the opportunity to officially present my case and information, so we can lead by example with law. I have already been waiting too long, but I will be here waiting, and doing so while steadfastly stewarding this bank into the 21st century. To the staff, to all of you, all of the accomplishments that I outlined today are possible because of your hard work. And as I told you at our very first town hall, I will always have your back. So stay focused on your amazing work. Stay focused on this report. And let's keep improving lives. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, presidente Claver-Carone. Ahora le paso la palabra al
Thank you,
moderador.
President Claver-Carone. Now I turn the floor to the moderator. We have now Eric Parrado, the Chief Economist, IDB Research Department. Mr. Parrado, please, he will act as moderator of this event. Mr. Parrado, please. We apologize, but the interpreters cannot hear the speaker.
Una disculpa, un minuto que vamos a cambiar el
We
micrófono.
apologize. Give us 1 minute. We will change the microphone that Mr. Parrado is using.
Perfecto, muchas gracias. Bueno, vamos a empezar de nuevo. Entonces,
Thank you very much. So let me start anew, simply for this to go on record and for the future. I am very grateful for your presence with us today. It is the first time that we're following a hybrid format for the presentation of the macroeconomic report. 3 years ago, we had problems in being able to organize this, so I'm very happy to come here. I'd like to thank the presence of President Claver-Carone for his introductory words with the initial context in order to kick off this conversation on the macroeconomic challenges in the region. But before we begin with the agenda, I would like to express my gratitude to the 4 coordinators of the macroeconomic report for Latin America 2022, Eduardo Cavallo, Arturo Galindo, Victoria Nuguer, Andy Powell, for extraordinary work. And I say this very sincerely, highly committed to the challenges that will be faced and that are being faced by the region currently. And I would also like to thank the team with Pablo Bachelet for the communication support and Mariela for the logistics involved in this event, and everybody who's behind the scenes providing support for the launching of this very important report for the IDB. As last year, we had the support of the municipal and reporting team for the fiscal analysis of the IDB. And this year, we brought in the labor market division for an analysis of labor markets. So I also extend to them my gratitude to each and every one of them. And this effort, obviously, is seeing the light today, thanks to the permanent support of our president of EPS, Benigno Lopez, who pushes us to continue bringing together the world of research with the world of public politics. And that's very important because it's very much aligned with what we've done in recent years in our research department. I also thank, on behalf of the team, the VPC, headed by Richard Martinez, for the valuable comments, revisions, suggestions, and all the support that they always provide us with these reports. And last but not least, I'd like to thank the research assistants in our departments who supported us throughout the production stages. So thank you to all of you. And as the president said, this year, the title of the report is From Recovery to Renaissance, Turning Crisis into Opportunity. And perhaps this is the most complex report that we've prepared in recent years. For the second time in 3 years, we were compelled, or we forced ourselves to reopen the report and to rewrite it completely anew. And this time it was even more complex because we had to work on details of the report up to the very last minute in external circumstances that couldn't be more complex and changing. We're going through crucial times of great uncertainty for the region and for the world in general. Initially, the main focus of the report was to provide ideas in order to take advantage of the recovery from COVID-19 to be able to bring about profound changes in the region and thus be able to have greater, more inclusive growth to the levels that we had before the pandemic. However, the current situation, geopolitical situation in Europe, triggered a whole set of economic tensions that led us to reconsider the immediate challenges in the region and how to navigate the prices of commodities and energy. And to this, we add the pressures of lower growth, in particular in developed countries, and greater inflationary pressures throughout the world. But at the same time, it opens up opportunities for the region to contribute to mitigate these impacts at a global level. But there's no doubt that the region is coming out of the COVID-19 crisis poorer, more indebted, and with economies that have been seriously stricken in the productive units, the shocks left by the pandemic. To this, we add those that are coming from the war in Ukraine. In some cases, and depending on the export situation of some commodities, some countries could even be strengthened with this, at least in the short term. And in others, obviously, the opposite could happen. In any case, irrespective of what the specific impact of the war is in each country, those responsible for public policies cannot forget about structural problems. And that is very important to be borne in mind because this inhibits medium and long-term growth. One of those problems has to do with what happens in the labor market, the recovery of growth, which was seen since last year, which in a way was not reflected in similar growth in employment, particularly for women and the most vulnerable segments of our society. Labor informality went back to its pre-pandemic levels, and it is an essential hurdle for growth of productivity in the region. And these results perhaps will turn poverty into something that will not decrease as previously, particularly if we see a rise in inflation. We need labor policies, fiscal policies, and monetary policies in order to preserve stability and promote sustainable and inclusive long-term growth beyond the recovery of the COVID-19 crisis or the impact of the war. We cover these issues in the report with an emphasis on the reforms that will assist to reduce the informality, to deal with low productivity, allowing small and medium-sized companies to grow, to hire more, to export more, and to build much more resilient economies. Today's presentation will be made by two of the coordinators of the report, Arturo Galindo, who is the chief economist, principal economist of the research department, and he will begin by concentrating on the latest months and macroeconomic implications on external accounts with possible scenarios of growth to which the region will be faced in the coming months. And then Victoria Nuguer, senior economist of the IDB research department, will present the main recommendations in fiscal, monetary terms, and for the labor market. The presentation of them should take approximately 25 minutes. And after the presentation by the coordinators, we will have the honor of having the participation of two top-of-the-line panelists who will share with us their comments. Marcela Meléndez, who is the chief economist, UNDP chief economist for Latin America and the Caribbean, and Alexandre Tombini, chief representative of the BIS Office for the Americas. So we're very grateful to both for their willingness to participate, and we will follow closely your comments. If you have any questions, the chat is open to get your questions, and if time allows for that, we will answer these between the coordinators and our guests. So once again, we thank each and every one of you for your interest and for being with us. And now, without further ado, let me turn the floor to Arturo so that he can begin with the presentation. Thank you very much.
Perfecto. Bueno, muchas gracias, Eric.
Thank you, Eric. Maybe the best way to begin is by showing the presentation on the screen, obviously. Now. Perfect. I was saying that maybe the best way to begin thinking how the current scenario is going to affect the macroeconomic situation in Latin America and the Caribbean is to place ourselves where we were 1 week before the war between Russia and Ukraine. After a very strong recovery in 2021, and after the very difficult situation in 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were expecting the region to go back to average growth rates in the medium and long term that were a little bit above 2%. And it's quite a low growth, average growth rate compared to other parts in the world. In spite of this, there were risks associated with this dynamic, recovery dynamic, risks mainly associated to the evolution itself of the pandemic, new variants of the virus, vaccination access, access to medication, and so forth. And in addition to these risks, we had the normalization of the monetary policy. Given the inflationary shocks that we were facing, we were already seeing all these adjustments in the monetary policy that could have a serious impact. However, then we had the war. The war broke out between Ukraine and Russia. And in addition to the previous risks that I just mentioned, we had to take into consideration additional risks. On the one hand, the commodities whose price had increased in 2021 continued to increase. I'm talking about mining products, energy, foods, all these experience these trends. And we have to understand that Russia plays quite an important role in certain international markets. Something else that was happening at the same time as the war was a reduction in economic growth projections in the developed world. For example, in the United States, the economic growth projections right now are 1 percentage point below what was expected before the war. In Europe, we're talking about 1 or 2 percentage points below what was expected before the war. So right now, the region, in addition to the risks that we had already identified, we are facing additional risks that have to do with the war itself. And here in the bank, we developed certain models to understand the different scenarios of the economic situation in the region. And we added a host of global elements. And we use these models in order to understand, on the one hand, the impact of the war and what that may entail in terms of economic growth in the coming years. And on the other hand, on top of that impact, see what the monetary policy may do if it has to be intensified or not, based on an increase, for example, on the price of commodities because of the war. In the first scenario, what we see is that there is a host of factors that are moving in opposite directions. We have increased price of commodities and a reduction in growth in developed countries in the world. And regarding the countries in the region, these things, especially the former, is affected in different ways depending on their net exports. Now, for the region all, what we are seeing in the models is the commodities impact is favorable in the short term, and this impact will decrease slowly as commodities prices start getting lower and lower, as you can see on the screen. And then, in addition to this, we see also less growth, global growth, that will have an impact on the economic activity also on the region, in the region. Now, what we're also seeing is that maybe in 2022, the situation in the region may be a little bit more favorable than what we were seeing before the war. We see a positive effect of the commodities prices, and in the longer term, 2023, 2024, we would see lower growth. However, the situation is not significantly different from the one before the war in that sense. What we see is that on average, between 2022 and 2024, the region would lose around 0.2 to 1 percentage points. And obviously there's differences among countries, but that's more or less based on aggregated data. Now, if there's a normalization of the monetary policy in the developed world, especially in the United States, that may lead to an increase in interest rates and to have balance sheets above what we are expecting today, balance sheets of the central banks above what we're expecting right now. That could complicate the situation for the region. We would see an increase in the cost of financing, and that would lead to lower growth than what we were foreseeing before the war. On average, in that sense, between 2022 and 24, the region could lose 1.5 points. So what we did in the report, based on this global context, is the following. We analyzed a series of specific policies, such as monetary policies, fiscal policies, labor policies, the challenges faced the different countries in order to implement those policies in the coming years. So I will begin now talking a little bit about external accounts. When the war started, one of the biggest concerns that we had was the following. What would the impact be on the different global economic channels, and how that would have an impact on the region, also in terms of trade? One clear channel was exports, and as the president said during his presentation, what we were seeing at that point is that that was kind of contained. The region, in general terms, doesn't export that much directly to Russia, with some exceptions, obviously, regarding very specific products. And likewise, it doesn't import a lot from Russia. In order to understand this, regarding exports and imports in total terms for an average country, direct trade with Russia doesn't represent more than 0.3% of total exports or total imports in the region. So except very specific cases, there was not a very serious direct impact in that sense. Like the president said, the most important matter would be the imports of fertilizers, and that is reflected in the imports in the region of this type of products. Now, we see challenges for foreign trade, and therefore we need to diversify this origin of exports. We also see opportunities linked to the fact that the region is very well positioned right now in order to be able to supply a series of markets with products that will see a disturbance because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Now, on top of those trade channels, we also have financial channels. When we explored this, we started looking for things that were obvious, very important transmission mechanism in the past. For example, transmission through shocks in international banks that had activity, a lot of activity in Russia and in other countries in the region simultaneously. We saw that that channel was or is quite contained at this point. However, with financial matters, we also need to understand that risks start coming up here and there when you least expect it, and you have to be very careful and pay a lot of attention in this sense. Now, what is absolutely clear from a financial standpoint is that the cost of financing for the region in general and for the entire world is actually increasing. It's going up, and it had been going up since last year as the economies were recovering and we were seeing inflationary pressures in many countries in the world. However, with the war in Ukraine, the war that started a couple of weeks ago, we've seen that some of the prices of treasury bonds, for example, have increased for all countries in the world, and that has had an impact on the yield curve. We've seen also that the curve has actually flattened a lot, and that means that there is an excess of demand for liquidity, and that has made rates increase. That's a global issue. It's not specific to Latin America and the Caribbean. In fact, the measures in terms of sovereign, and in this case, we analyzed the spreads of the NB increased a little bit when the war broke out, but then they went quickly back to their pre-war levels. And that is actually a signal that the financing cost doesn't have to do with issues that are inherent to the region, but because of external factors. And this is very important because the needs for external financing in the region have increased lately. While the pandemic, current account balances closed in most countries of the region with the recovery of these deficits, in the future, different countries will have different situations depending on the price of commodities. But in general, we are seeing an increase in the need for external financing. And all this takes us to the need to review all the documents to understand what makes economies able to maintain constant inflow or an access to external market.
Una serie de factores que afectan.
We identified a series of factors that affected the disruption or not of capital flows. In different cases, the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean, they're better positioned now than in previous exercises. For example, we can compare now the situation now with the 28 financial crisis or the current situation with how the economies in the region were before the pandemic in 2020. The region today has cushions of international reserves. In that sense, they're very strong in terms of the dollarization of their liabilities. And we saw that the region had improved compared to the situation before the pandemic. After the pandemic, the situation with the liabilities worsened a little bit, but we are not in a highly vulnerable situation compared to the past. Current account deficits are right now a little bit higher than what they were before the pandemic, but again, they're significantly lower than how they were in 2007 before the financial crisis. Our concerns, well, fiscal buffers during the pandemic, deficits increased, indebtedness levels also increased, and obviously we faced a very serious, unprecedented shock, but right now the region has to look for ways to rebuild those fiscal buffers in order to guarantee access, continued access to capital markets. As I was saying in the report, we will analyze very specific policies, and I'm talking about monetary, labor, and fiscal policies linked to this situation. And to do so, I would like to offer the floor right now to Victoria Nuguer.
Gracias, Arturo. Bueno, otro de los desafíos que
Thank you, Arturo. Another challenge faced by the region is inflation. At the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, inflation was at historical minimums. In 2021, with a recovery in the offer, in the demand and the bottlenecks on the supply, inflation accelerated. We were expecting in 2022 for inflation to start slowing down a little bit. However, the war and increase in the price of oil and commodities, in fact, made the inflation to reach 7.5% in the region. And obviously, in this scenario, the expectations have increased in only 2 months. In fact, for all different monetary regimes, inflation increased, and we expect, analysts think that by the end of this year, inflation may be 1 percentage point higher than what they expected at the beginning of the year. And in fact, certain countries have seen a much larger increase, and that brings the inflation expectation above the higher range of the meta level for central bank. Obviously, this risk of de-anchoring of expectations could actually lead to loss of credibility. Now, central banks were already normalizing their interest rates with minimum levels. With the minimum levels during COVID, we had historical low interest rates, and they started increasing them. And by December 2021, central banks had increased interest rates in more or less 3 percentage points on average. There were certain countries whose inflation rate was interest rate was a little higher. Now there's a change in the expectations, and we've seen an acceleration in the increase of interest rates. In only 3 months, we saw an increase on average of 2 percentage points with different established inflationary goals. Now, the challenge that central banks will face is, on the one hand, to control inflation, minimizing the impact with economic growth. And that's very important to take this into account. So now, in terms of monetary policy, the region will face higher inflation levels in the coming months. The monetary policy is more effective. In other words, the cost of products is lower when it's highly credible. The policies are transparent, or policy frameworks are transparent. Banks are independent, and there's a consistent communication strategy. The monetary policy has to be more effective and has to have the same effect in terms of inflation and lower cost. And here it's important to understand the high inflation rates would reduce the debt in real terms. That will lead interest rates to go up. Interest rates going up, that would increase the cost of financing, and with this increase, that could lead maybe to a fall in the price of products, and that would increase the ratio, the debt-income ratio. The monetary policy would be affected. If there is a more flexible fiscal policy, we could have an increase in interest rates, so increase in the costs of financing, and a decrease in the GDP. So the initial shock of a more flexible fiscal policy would be negatively affected by the monetary policy. That's why it's so important for the monetary policy to focus on the fiscal policy to move towards consolidation. In fact, before the pandemic, the primary fiscal balance was -1%. Later on, the primary fiscal deficit got to -5%. And then last year was in 3%. This fiscal consolidation process was not only because of a reduction in the expenditures, but also an increase of fiscal revenues. And it's very important that in 2022, we continue with this consolidation process. Commodity shock, one could say that would be very positive for many countries, especially in fiscal terms, but it's not necessarily the case, as Arturo was saying, in terms of product or output, rather. The countries that export commodities will see an increase in fiscal terms, but they will also need to increase subsidies for the population to counteract the increase of prices. Countries that import commodities obviously will experience a negative shock for the entire region, taking into account those countries that depend on tourism and commodities. Debt will go up, the debt over GDP. And if we find a situation where the normalization of monetary policies in advanced countries is more complicated than we are expecting, we'll see an increase in the cost of financing and a decrease in output. Therefore, all these paths will take us to an increase of the debt GDP. And like I said, fiscal consolidation is truly important, and how it is carried out even more so. If we have a consolidation process, bringing down expenditures and conserving investment could bring benefits in terms of output that are sustainable and long-lasting. Temporary income that are having are that temporary. That can be used in order to increase their savings or pay debt. And here it's key to coordinate all this with the monetary policy. And this consolidation process will not be successful if it doesn't come hand in hand in order to reduce informality and tax evasion. All these problems are truly related to asymmetric information or lack of information. Therefore, digitalization for tax registries and transactions could lead to a reduction in these frictions. This could be complemented by tax on the earned income tax. EITC is the acronym in English, and basically it fosters formalization. And what it doesn't do is to subsidize informality. Imposing a value-added tax to the most vulnerable population is a more progressive approach. And obviously, in order to reduce informality, we will also need the labor policy to complement all this. In terms of the labor market, it really suffered because of the pandemic. We saw a decrease in the labor market. Many SMEs shut down, and informality also fell. Informal employment, in fact, was a buffer in moments of crisis. And this crisis, given its characteristics and given the characteristics of informal employment, informal jobs, where there is high levels of contact, was very affected. So informality fell by 20% versus 2020 in only 4 months. So this graph shows that by the end of last year, employment is going back to pre-pandemic levels, but this is not the entire story, because we saw an increase in the labor force and in employment. If we thought, for example, there was no shock, by September of 2021, we would have, or we had a deficit of 6 percentage points for women's employment versus 1% for men's employment. And this deficit affected the entire region. Deficit. And that's how many of the achievements and that were attained in the region were lost. Now, what can countries do in order to foster employment, have better jobs, more productive, and reduce informality? We have to accelerate the recovery of the labor market to begin with, and in order to do so, transfers to workers and bringing liquidity to businesses will continue to be important, and they need to be complementary to policies that facilitate mobility and workers towards more productive industries that are moving forward. Now, credits to contracts will help us create employment, and that would also complement a negative income tax, the one that I was mentioning before. We are undergoing a digitalization and automation process in the region. Governments need to tap or take advantage of this moment in order to continue with this momentum and have more productive jobs. We need also policies to train workers to improve their skills, and also include the women in the labor market, improve childcare, also technical assistance for SMEs, reduction about how to reduce costs, how to increase their sales. That could all be very useful. And then before the pandemic, the region already struggling with certain deficiencies. We need to correct, therefore, these structural problems. That is going to be key. And in terms of, for example, social security, we need to make sure that it reaches everyone. That should also be an objective. So making sure that social security benefits are universal, regardless of the status of the employer. That's very important. And that they are financed actually by general taxes, not only labor taxes. Therefore, the region right now needs very active policies in order to accelerate employment and informality. We need to bridge the gender gap, which is truly important at this moment, and we have the opportunity to do so. Governments today are facing a triple challenge to develop policies to recover from the shock, improve employment quality, and address those structural problems that I mentioned. Now, the labor reforms that are implemented will leave us better prepared for future shocks. Crisis will come, and implementing these changes will allow us today to make sure that those who are most vulnerable suffer less. Now, I will conclude my presentation by saying the following. Before the war, the region was experiencing long-term growth, but at low levels. We were moving in that direction. The war and normalization of the monetary policy in advanced countries is making the recovery to take place slowly, slower than it was. The region can actually mitigate global effects of the war in international markets. For example, the oil prices and commodity prices are affecting the international market that is already highly affected by the pandemic. The region is in place in order to help in this case. Now, the region will experience inflation that will continue to go up. Therefore, in order to coordinate fiscal policy with monetary policy will be critical in the region. The region needs to maintain credibility in central banks, the credibility that they attained over the last decades, and it would be highly costly if inflation expectations de-anchor. Financing costs continue to grow. Reducing debt must be a priority in the region. Reducing current expenditures will actually allow us to have a consolidation process. In the coming months, the region will experience a unique situation and an opportunity window in order to improve the architecture of fiscal and labor policy. We can decrease informality, increase inclusive growth, and improve the quality of expenditures. Thank you very much for paying attention to my presentation, and I truly invite you to read the report about Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you.
Bueno, bueno.
Pero no ese es el micrófono. Claro. Sí.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Victoria y Arturo, por la presentación.
Thank you, Victoria and Arturo, for your presentation. This is just an appetizer, basically. In 25 minutes, we tried to summarize the report, economic report, 2022 report for Latin America and the Caribbean. But there's a lot of material that we've developed together with other departments. So I would like to invite you to read the entire report, and I'm sure that our guests read the report beginning to end, and we will have now a very interesting discussion. We have 10 minutes now for asking questions and making comments, or rather, I would like to offer the floor now to Marcela and Alexandre to make comments. Marcela will start. Marcela, go ahead. Good morning. I don't know if I can share my screen. Yes, of course you can. Okay, there it is. First of all, I would like to congratulate because this report is clearly timely, and as it was said at the beginning, as Eric said at the beginning, it was complicated since we had to act very fast in a very ever-changing situation. What I most liked about the report is that call to think about structural part of what made us so fragile in order to respond to such a serious shock as the pandemic were precisely the structural problems that existed before the pandemic and that do not disappear once the pandemic is under control. I will focus my remarks on the labor because I think it is truly important to put this topic on the table, and I think that is part of the matters that we need to address. We need labor markets that work. That is a prerequisite for economies to actually move towards sustainable growth. And that's the biggest challenge for the region in terms of recovering from the crisis and to build more egalitarian societies. In Latin America, basically, Latin America was very hard hit by the pandemic, and it broke at its weakest points. We've normalized some things that in reality should not. And I hope my comments add to the chapter about labor markets. I truly agree with the report, and I think this chapter about the labor market must be read because it provides us with an outlook and the priorities that the region should focus on. What do I want to address right here? Well, something that we've normalized in our respective countries, which is the high percentage of workers that are self-employed and that are actually owners of very small businesses. The average business in Latin America has 3 workers, and that is part of the tragedy that is linked to informality, defined as lack of social coverage, of social security coverage, but it's also associated to other things. The possibility to accumulate capital is very low when you work by yourself. There is a part that has to do with training, that has to do also with meeting with other employees in the workplace, and that is something that doesn't really happen in Latin America. And the contrast is enormous when you analyze the United States. If we pre-pandemic in 2019 is what you have on the screen, and you can see that in Latin America, 32% of workers were in businesses with 10 or more employees, and that it was 70% in the United States.
And only 18% in Latin America, the Caribbean, of workers belong to big companies, 100 employees or more, while 56% of the workers are in the US. And this could go along with countries that have different levels of development. But this is one of the things that places us in a very bad condition to be able to move forward, particularly when one sees self-employment and employment in these very small businesses that is concentrated on the lowest quintiles of income distribution. So this is what you can see up here in the square that is highlighted for Latin America. On the other hand, employees that are in companies that are not classified as companies of 10 employees and more. So these are not micro businesses. These are larger businesses, and they're concentrated, as you can see here. So this is an issue that has to do with a distribution of labor between sizes of a business, including self-employment, which in a way is a mirror of income distribution, personal income distribution in Latin America and the Caribbean, that lies behind what I would call, and with this, I go back to the narrative of the regional UNDP, which is low growth that we see in the region, which is where we were before the pandemic, and which gets complicated with the pandemic and with this juncture. Look at what happened in the US as a contrast, and how we see the employee distributed essentially. It is true that there's a highest share of employees in big companies between the employees of the 20th richest percent, but there's a majority of workers that is in companies, larger companies. And so this is what we see behind these more egalitarian societies, as well as economies that perform better. When one takes a look at how this is reflected and how this is linked to the risks of workers, we see that against the income of an average worker, there's high income and high informality in the smallest units. Low income, high informality is what we see. And this taps a very high share of employment. And this even happens within categories of employment. It is not that self-employed people, freelancer people make less, or that they have a more precarious job simply for the mere fact that they're less educated. The fact is that even when one starts off with the employment based on the educational achievements of adult people, it happens that even less educated workers do much better when they work in larger companies. So perhaps a major message is the bet on productivity in the region that must be focused on improving small and medium-sized companies and to create the conditions so that these SMEs can grow and absorb the labor force that is now highly fragmented in employment and in many businesses. And also for these companies to exert the pressure and competition to the larger businesses that dominate many of our most important markets. We have gigantic companies that are more productive than all the others that we have in our countries, but that do not compete well in terms of competitiveness with companies of the same size outside the region. So these are a relatively low productivity, bearing in mind their size, but much more productive than the rest of the companies. And partly this happens because we have the labor force that is extremely fragmented in the lowest segment of distribution and a capacity of generating interesting competition levels in local markets. The other major message that would have to come out here, and this is something that I don't know whether I missed, but I would add this to the labor markets chapter, is please let us not have a more entrepreneurial program because they contribute to the job insecurity, low productivity. When one takes a look at the offer of services, of training services for our countries, it is very painful to see that a very high share of students in courses concentrate on management programs. We've created a culture where people aspire to create their own small business, and we have to acknowledge that not everybody throughout the income distribution and educational distribution and basic capital distribution are potential entrepreneurs, and that maybe all of a sudden we can have higher productivity and better living conditions if we work as employees. Sometimes it is necessary to support many businesses because these are subsistence conditions, and this happened during the pandemic. So we had to try to help people that had a small business, but we have to see them and recognize them as what they are, and not to think that on the basis of strengthening the micro business, that exists in our countries is a way of improving the quality of life of people and productivity. And last but not least, I wanted to show you something that comes out of high-frequency telephone polls that we've carried out in the course of this last year together with the World Bank. Because what is interesting, and this is food for thought on how to understand labor markets, to see what happens within. When one talks about the results that we see in household surveys, usually they don't have a way of following the same person over time. So we hide many movements, and I believe that this is interesting. We saw, and here you see on one side, we have the transitions during the pandemic, and on the other one, on the other extreme, where people were by mid-2020. And what you see is that, in fact, there's a significant destruction of formal jobs that go to the informality part to the center, and a significant share that goes to being inactive. People who've already gave up, but they desisted, at least temporarily, 15 months after the pandemic begun, of being part of the labor market and then remaining inactive. And then you see that there's something that we had not seen before with these household surveys, which is very impressive, and that is why I bring it into the conversation. And it is that a very high share of people were inactive, and they joined the labor market during the pandemic. It is an unprecedented share. It is not normal from one year to the other one with the surveys that in Peru allow us to see how people move from being inactive to being active. Obviously, there's a movement during all these periods, but never like this. And we see that many of these inactive people join the labor market. They find a job in the informality, many of them in the formal market, and part of it will simply thicken the lines of unemployment. And this is very different when we see men and women. And so out of the data that we see a story that comes out, which is somewhat different than the one we saw at the beginning of the pandemic. When the pandemic began, and we see women lose their jobs in a higher proportion, a higher share than men, and many of them became inactive. And what we see is mothers, households with dependent children that are becoming inactive, and we see this as something with which we have to be very careful. If you take a look at the data 15 months later, what we see is that the people living and becoming inactive are not necessarily mothers with dependent children. There are mothers with dependent children, most of them, but there are many women and men without children that are becoming inactive. And essentially, it has a characteristic that brings them together, which are less educated people, workers with maximum primary level education. And then when we see who becomes active, even though as a share of those who remain inactive and join the labor market is higher, that of men than women, because women, there's a much higher share of women that are inactive or remain inactive, the way we measure this in the different surveys. And what we see is that for every man that joins the labor force, we have 1.6 women joining the labor force during the pandemic, and most of them mothers, heads of households with dependent children. And these are people who come into the labor market with jobs, informal jobs, with more probability than others, and that have less hours of work as an average per week than people who were working before. When we see that there's a drop in the number of hours of work a day that people are investing, particularly for women during the pandemic, it is the same coming group that is bringing this drop. Why? Because this is important in order to put it into one of the greatest messages of the report of the IDB. Programs, transfer programs that were not enough to respond to the shock. I read the amounts of people that became, that joined the labor force after being inactive as people who were forced or compelled to become active in order to contain the drop in revenue of their families. And then there's another issue. There's a part of the history that is linked to looking after minors and because of the crisis, and I'm not minimizing that by no means. But there's another part that is called an insufficient response by governments because we didn't have what to do in order to respond. And we did use transfer programs, which is what we had, but we had Social Security issues very badly assembled. Other stories in other countries where people were easily be in a good situation because there was some sort of registry, and part of the cost of informality is not being apparent, and people who ended up being unemployed that did not appear in social records, and they were not identified as the poorest, and it was difficult to reach them. Social assistance programs and Social Security systems and programs have to be seen as complements and substitutes to have social protection systems that work well. The movement towards a universality in insurance is the path, and we fully agree with this. We have a huge agreement with the message sent by the IDB in improving the capacity to respond by governments, the quality of life of people, and to facilitate the reorganization of the productive activity and employment. Because with the way we have financed our social security systems, leveraged in taxes on payroll, then we're creating some incentives, and we're adding taxes of being imposed on the possibility of companies of operating and growing. And we're imposing additional costs for workers to be able to be covered by Social Security systems. And I'll leave it at that. Congratulations, and thank you very much for inviting me to this conversation. And I believe that we have chapters in the report that are so vast that we can delve deeper into these issues, the key issues that are important for the region during this juncture. Thank you. Thank you, Marcela, for your comments, not only because they're additional to ours, and that in a way reflects a certain consistency, but also in order to challenge inertia. And I like this issue of not normalizing these things, that we take them because they're there and we do nothing to change them. So I believe that we have to insist in terms of asking these more difficult questions and trying to change the status quo. And with this, I leave Alexandre to share with us his comments. So Alexandre, let me share with you this space. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Eric, for inviting me to discuss this report. And as you said, it's complex to write about finance and economy in these very changing times that we've seen recently. So I support the team because I believe you've done an extraordinary job. They've touched on the crucial issues for the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. So congratulations for that publication. And I'd like it to begin by saying that from our point of view, the most urgent challenge is the high level of inflation that we witness, that we see now in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this brings the ghosts of the past, fiscal dominance, high inflationary expectations, as well as the oldest spirals and prices and salaries that are with us in a not very distant past in the region. And above all, because of what we find in the report, and also something that we discussed this morning, the harmful effect that inflation, particularly high levels of inflation, bring upon low-income groups in particular that cannot be protected against rise in prices. They don't have savings, they don't have any financial instruments that will provide the protection in generalized protection against prices and rise in prices. We know that inflation shortens the horizons by halting important economic decisions, for example, on investment that touch on potential growth of our economies. So it is an important time in history, and therefore my comments here will concentrate on the issue of inflation.
First of all, the elements behind this high inflation and the conditions that may persist in the coming future. And at the end, I will talk about economic policy and some final comments. And complementing what Marcela said about labor markets, I will focus more on inflation because of my background, but at the end of the day, we're actually talking about impact on the population of Latin America and the Caribbean. Well, after the contraction that we saw in 2020, strong recovery in 2021, the growth outlook for Latin America and the Caribbean by 2022 was the following, that these economies will go back to their high levels of growth. Rather, the war in Ukraine, normalization of policies and advanced economies, and new possibilities, the ever-changing variants of COVID have made this scenario more unstable and increases the discrepancies in terms of growth. In spite of the increase in commodities prices, as it has been said, there is a risk for the region to have low growth rates, which would have a negative impact on exporters of commodities, and different types of impact, actually. Some will have a positive impact in the short term, but not necessarily in the medium or long term. And that could actually worsen even more poverty that actually considerably increased as a consequence of the pandemic. And this is also documented in the report by the IDB. Unfortunately, we are currently experiencing a situation where the labor market has not recovered the economy, and informality has increased, and female participation in the labor market has actually decreased. Marcela has added a lot of information in this regard. Inflation decreased during 2020, but since the beginning of 2021, it started to rapidly increase. At the beginning, it was considered that this increase could be something temporary, but by mid-2021, it was higher and more persistent. As we know, inflation is a global phenomenon, but it has seriously affected the region. Our region, Latin America, inflation is very high compared to other countries such as developed or emerging countries. Currently, these high inflation rates and the potential de-anchoring of expectations are the greatest challenge faced by central banks and governments. Poverty will increase, and therefore, I'm going to focus on inflation during my remarks. The first question is, why did inflation increase? Well, different reasons. That in the report, I would like to highlight the strong recovery of the demand supported by policies to react to the pandemic, monetary and fiscal policies that lead some economies in the region to overheating conditions. We saw recomposition of the demand between services. Services were affected by the pandemic. The demand turned and focused on goods, and we saw a very strong recovery in this regard. And also a recovery in terms of case. Then the supply, the problems with supply chains because of the pandemic, and the incapacity to supply an increase in the demand, especially last year. an increase in prices of foods and energy given the strong recovery, and adjustments in the supply because of the situation that we saw in terms of the commodities industries over the last year. In countries where we have a flexible exchange rate, we have several. The main economies in the region also contributed to depreciations of the exchange rate, especially in 2020, a little less in 2021, where we saw an increase of prices and inflation that we're experiencing at this moment. Now, looking forward, the elements behind inflationary pressure don't seem to give in. We could be facing a long term of high and persistent inflation. What are the elements that could maintain this high inflation over the coming months? Well, here we could highlight three different common elements. Expectations, even though long-term expectations have not increased. However, the compensations that we've seen in the short term in terms of inflation and financial indicators have been already affected by that increase in prices. The weak link between exchange rate, relative prices, and generalized pressure by inflation characterized a period with lower inflation. So we're talking of the shocks of relative prices. They were self-corrected, and that had an impact on the general inflation. But now where we have a situation with higher inflation, this dynamic of changing relative prices has led to higher generalized inflation in the world, in the entire world, but in the region specifically too. We also see that when inflation starts to affect the purchase of the population, it's very probable to see more adjustments in salaries. Now, looking forward, we may see how globalization effects may be reversed compared to what we enjoyed over the last years. The situation is ever changing. The war in Ukraine is basically an element that is exacerbating inflationary pressures, accelerating the deglobalization process. While these factors are happening at a global level, we have economies in Latin America that are highly affected by this potential process, where we'll see a reduction in the globalization and its positive effects that we saw last year. Here, we are in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's important to mention some aggressive adjustments in salaries in order to compensate inflation. We may see also, or we, as a way to prepare themselves for also high inflation in the future. We see a high level of indexation in the economies, expectations in the medium term that have already been affected throughout this time. And then we've also seen adjustments in prices, anticipating the costs of some products, as we have seen in some economies in the region. I think the good news here is that central banks are paying attention to this phenomenon. They're fully aware and of their risks. And what we saw in Latin America is that central banks have been the first ones in the world to start withdrawing stimulus packages, monetary stimulus, for example, in a consistent manner, trying to avoid de-anchoring of inflation expectations. This in our region already started during the first quarter of 2021. Compared to other places, they are a little ahead vis-a-vis the rest of the world, because we were already suffering inflationary pressures in 2021. However, these increases so far have managed to barely overcome the slow growth rate. Real rates have increased very moderately, and they're still below, or rather, they're still at very low levels, historically speaking, for our region. There's a key issue here. Central banks in our region need to take action and try to reduce the impact on economic activity. It's better to take action right now and not later, because otherwise rates would continue to go up in the future. Central banks, Latin American central banks, have reacted already. They started taking action at the beginning of last year compared to other central banks in the world. There's a dilemma between activity and inflation. And to this dilemma, we have to add another one, which has to do with financial stability. We see an increase in the interest rates in an environment of high debt levels, not only public, but also private debt. Worsen bank risk indicators, even though the financial system so far has been actually strength for Latin American economies, at least for the main economies in the region, because we see that the financial system has actually worked and it's worked as a buffer of the impact by the pandemic and now by the war in Ukraine. But we have to continue to be alert, because as we saw in the report, it could be that in the future we may have to address other type of issues in this regard. And now to wrap up, I would like to say that we need to be cautious in Latin America and the Caribbean. Global financial markets have actually been quite cautious, and we need to continue to be so. We've seen a slow and moderate increase in labor markets, and that could reflect small risk premiums. So we have the main economies and the advanced economies. In the case of for example, US, they are embarked in a process of normalizing monetary conditions. Maybe markets will continue to gradually react to it in a cautious manner. We know this environment very well in Latin America. As a consequence, I think that, or in conclusion, I think that what the report identifies as important, we need to have credible fiscal measures in order to have a solid macroeconomic framework. We need to consolidate inflation and prevent acute increases in risk premiums in the region. The increase in commodity prices, as we know, because of the war in Ukraine, may lead to improvements in some countries that could actually help some countries in terms of public finance. But I think what was said here was very important. We need to understand that this improvement is something, this increase in the prices is something temporary, and we need to strengthen macroeconomic frameworks, because, like I said, this increase in prices may be supported by greater demand by commodities in the future, as we saw in the 2000s, at the beginning of the 2000s, when China and India were joining consumption markets. Prices stayed high for a long time, but not forever. And this is, we also need to take into account the problems that we face in terms of supply, but also what we have in terms of demand. So we need to understand, like I said, that this situation is temporary, and we need to take the necessary measures. Given monetary and fiscal policies, I don't think they will be able to foster the economy, and that growth will have to be fostered by structural reforms in the labor market through formalization, and how to do this will be key. I think there are solid suggestions in this regard, and also in terms of fiscal policy. I think that the IDB's report is very timely in order to provide some guidelines to countries in the region, and in order for them to be able to face the challenges that they will soon be facing. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, and for relating this on the impact of the lower income segments. It is very important not to forget that inflation is not only a number, it's a number that affects the life, and therefore there's a significant goal by central banks, which is not easy. And obviously, that is why we have that activity or proactivity that we see today in many central banks in the region. We are about to reach the end of our meeting, but I will ask you one question because we've covered a lot with the presentations and with your comments. And let me start with you, Alexandre. You spoke of inflation, of expectations. You also spoke of financial stability in a way, but it would be good if you could talk about the financial flows. How are these financial flows reacting nowadays vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine? And how do we see as a part of the expectations in Latin America versus other markets? Because it seems to me that this is a very different crisis from others that we've had in the past. Alexandre, I think it's a very important, what you're raising is really important, Derek, because this region does have the need for external financing. And we heard Arturo saying that these have gone up with the recent events. So I wanted to say that the flows were seriously affected in 2020, in March 2020, as we saw there was a huge drop, capital flight from the region, but then there was a very rapid recomposition, and there's several factors that there. Official sources of resources and liquidity, such as the IDB, the IMF, the World Bank, but also at a bilateral level, there was significant work by the Federal Reserve with the supply of swaps for bigger countries, for larger countries, but also other instruments, repo instruments, to provide low liquidity with guarantees. So this is important because it improved funding in dollars, and we saw significant cooperation efforts with the flows, even though these were not at pre-pandemic levels, but not at levels of crisis. And looking ahead, what we see now after the event in Ukraine is that the region has received flows. There's some factors. One, the price of commodities, the price of goods. In the short term, this has brought with it flows. And therefore, because of the high global inflation, I believe that commodities also work as a protection, as a hedge against inflation. So it has brought with it the flows. And also what we said recently, which is an advance of central banks in the region by raising the interest rates and the types, and therefore that led to interest spreads that invited the flows to the region. But if we look ahead, once again, we have several pieces being moved at the same time, and we see how there's an increase in the types and the shortening of the balance sheet of the Fed, and all of this could lead to high volatility, and countries have to do their homework, which is in this case reaching fiscal consolidation, placing it as the first thing to do, and to continue with the process of attempting to maintain expectations, inflation expectations, anchored with the eyes in the future. Thank you.
¿Ahora sí me escuchan? Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Yes. With this hybrid format, microphones are trying to do their best. But first of all, I wanted to thank you, Alexandre, for your comments in connection with capital flows. Obviously, we will follow closely what is happening, and what you were saying, concentrated on the reforms that must be carried out by our countries in order to continue attracting foreign investment. Marcela, one of the interesting issues that you covered is the size of SMEs. In general, what you were proposing is that the company, the most representative company, is that 3 people or more. You were not very much in agreement to continuing with these entrepreneurial movements and activities. What do we do in order to create the incentives for these companies to be much more productive, would be larger and bigger to contribute to the development of our countries? I think that a point of entry, and this is something you touch on in the report, is a reviewing regulation of labor markets. When one thinks of transfers or movements to universality in social protection systems, ultimately what we find behind is this. Let us see how we're regulated. And this is also extended to taxation. I believe that one part that is a prerequisite, which is having the regulatory frameworks that will generate or develop the correct incentives for companies to grow and not to have taxes imposed on growth. When we establish programs, special programs for different sizes of companies or different forms of organization, very frequently in our countries, there are discontinuities which are translated into perverse incentives. And I believe that this is part of what we find behind the way in which labor is organized. And something else that is also mentioned in your report has to do with the human capital that we're training, the manpower, the skills of people in order to be able to get hooked into the market adequately. And then the region has the huge challenge of how to improve the quality of education levels and training for workplace. Supply and demand should meet. When you speak of active policies in the labor market, it seems to me that the most important thing is to think again on how we think of employment services that are found. And then I think that several attempts have been made, and we have to reinvent other forms, or maybe digitalization might help. I heard some months ago at a meeting, a president of the guild offer a suggestion that was extraordinary. He said, if we now have the possibility with a digital technology to create apps, why not, can we not create apps where the various guilds of the entrepreneurial sector can tell us what they need so that the young people that are coming into the market to tertiary education will know where to find the demand, which is something that is a bit changing the intermediation. And I believe there's some of it where technology and development and the greatest penetration of internet that we achieved during the pandemic. Let's say this is a huge change that should inform us on what to do in the future. But what is important is for people to be trained in those things that are needed by the market, and that we raise the quality of education, because part of what is happening and the way we're organized is that we're bringing out people from the schools that barely writes and reads in many of the countries in the region. So that's my contribution. Very good. We always try to look for solutions that are easy, and usually solutions are complex. They go on regulatory incentives, training, education. So it seems to me that this is a final message in terms of trying to think about the different sectors in order to be able to move forward in terms of growth and economic development in our countries. So we're over the time that was scheduled. I'm very grateful to those who are present here, part of our public, the first hybrid event that we organized, and also to thank the people that are connected to this event. And obviously my profound and personal gratitude to Marcela, to Alexandre for their comments. We will take into account everything that they proposed and to continue working in order to continue supporting our countries. And obviously, I'd like to thank the coordinators of our people at the IDB for all the work they did in terms of reacting before COVID-19, but also reacting before the war. So with this, I bid you farewell, and I'm very, very grateful to each and every one of you for your interest. So we'll see you in the future.